Okay, and I'm still sharing, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Great. Okay, thank you all for taking the time to come and hopefully learn something new at a time of year where everybody's tired and has had a little bit of enough. So I always start my talks with a moment of just bringing in the focus and dropping into our bodies. So wherever you are sitting, put both feet flat on the ground. Imagine a ribbon attached to the top of your head, pulling you up, giving your organs more space to rest and expand in your abdomen. And let's take a slow, deep breath together. Then I want you to rub your hands together and just be reminded that these are instruments of healing that are attached to you all the time. And just bring a little bit of light to cover your eyes. Take another slow, deep breath. And a little bit of light to cover your neck and your voice box, the power of your speech. And take another slow, deep breath. And know that your gut microbes were present in that small experience and were benefited. So the three things we're going to explore this morning are your microbiome, which I'm going to go into detail about just now, your gut lining, which is your biggest interface actually between your body and the outside world, and your gut-brain axis. So the conversation that your gastrointestinal tract is having via neurons with your brain all the time. And I'm going to start by introducing you to one of my favorite creatures, the Hawaiian bobtail squid. So the Hawaiian bobtail squid lives off of the coast of Hawaii, and he is a master of disguise. During the day, he camouflages himself in the sand, and during the night, he hunts. And the way that he hunts efficiently is he bioilluminates to cancel out his shadow on the ocean floor under the light of the moon. So you can imagine the moonlight shining down over the squid that's approaching his prey. Without bioilluminating, his shadow would fall on the ground and alert his prey that he was coming. And in order to counter that shadow, he switches on a light. So how does he switch on this light? It's really beautiful. He has something called a mantle, which is a little bit like a kangaroo pouch. And as these bobtail squid are born, there is something attractive in this mantle of theirs that invites an organism called Vibrio fischeri into that pouch. And as the day progresses, the Vibrio fischeri divide and divide and divide and divide. And when they reach a critical number, it just so happens that that's the time that the moon arrives in the sky, they begin to communicate between one another as a community, and they switch on bioluminescence. And when the sun rises in the morning, they are light sensitive, they become uncomfortable in this mantle, and the squid expels them into the ocean and leaves just a couple nestling in the bottom of the pocket, and this whole process starts over again. And they divide and divide and divide and divide, and eventually they reach this critical number and they start communicating with each other. And once there are enough of them and the community is strong, they switch this light on, and he can go about his hunting without letting anybody know. And the reason I've introduced this talk with this organism is because this is such a beautiful example of symbiosis in nature. What does symbiosis mean? So symbiosis is two organisms coexisting with each other and benefiting one another in a really life-affirming or even life-essential way. And what's interesting about the squid is that the only organism that lives on or in the squid is Vibrio fischeri. So we're talking about one organism with one bacteria living on it. And you can see, yes.
Sorry, I want to interrupt because I'm not seeing a presentation.
Oh no, that's not good.
It might just be me.
Can everyone else see it?
No, I
No,
think
you are presenting, but
other
there's just
browser.
nothing showing. There's like no slide.
Oh
You
gosh.
need to share the specific screen that you want, like the presentation screen. I think it's the Chrome one.
Let me just go back to here and start again.
we can just see your Google Meet screen.
Yes, that's all.
There-
And now it's just all of us.
Okay.
And
now?
Okay, now
Yes.
we can see, but just expand it. Meet the Hawaiian bobtail, your micro. Yes, now we can see your presentation. Thanks.
Okay, perfect.
So thank you for. I wasn't sure
Lucy,
what was going.
please interrupt if we have another technical glitch. So this is this beautiful squid bioluminescing, which I just think is so miraculous and beautiful. And you can see on the right, there's this Petri dish where they've mimicked the same thing. So once the organisms reach a critical number in the Petri dish, they switch on the light. So what is this communal communication called? We call this quorum sensing. And this is quite a novel and exciting development in science and in the arena of infectious medicine, because we used to historically understand illness, for example, and let's talk about a pneumonia. We think, okay, there's a strep pneumonia causing a pneumonia. And what the problem is that we've been intruded by this organism and we need to kill off this organism. And actually, it's more complex than that, because we now know that strep pneumonia lives in our oropharynx all the time. It's always there. And what changes to allow the strep pneumonia to divide enough to cause a problem? And is it related to the communication between those microorganisms with each other? And so you can see in this little picture, when there's a low concentration, then the autoinducers, which are the communication molecules that the bugs chat to each other with, are not strong enough to send a message. But when there are enough of them and they're not alone, which is also quite a beautiful philosophical extrapolation about community, then they behave in this beautiful synchronized way as a community. And what's very cool about this is it might in the future change the way that we treat disease. So instead of wiping out a whole lot of things indiscriminately with broad spectrum antibiotics, what we might be able to do is start to influence the way that organisms communicate with each other. So drugs, for example, that might bind those autoinducers to switch them on or to switch them off. Or we might introduce other organisms that have a counter effect on the organism that's causing a problem. And so this is really novel, and it doesn't exist in practice anymore. Not anymore, but yet. But I think that this is something very interesting to watch in the future of medicine. So your microbiome. We spoke in the beginning about guarding your eyes and guarding your voice. And you can think of your microbiome as your first line of defense. And I always think about those beef eaters in front of the Queen's Palace. You are lined from your mouth to all the way down your gastrointestinal tract to your anus by gazillions and gazillions and gazillions of organisms, bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And historically, we used to think that these, I'm going to actually skip to another slide. Historically, we used to think, and there was a big debate going on between scientists, that these organisms were there to intrude and cause problems. And these were two very famous scientists in the history of the development of these ideas. There's Louis Pasteur, who you all know from pasteurization, and his philosophy was that the germ is causing the disease. And certainly I think there's an element of that, but he did a lot of public debating with a man called Béchamp. And Béchamp said, the problem isn't the organism, the problem is the environment. And I think modern medicine is moving more to marrying these two ideas, that it's not just the organism, it's the environment that the organism is flourishing or being kept in check. And I think COVID was a really good example of that, because we know for a fact that people who had a more inflamed fishbowl or more inflamed bio-environment were more vulnerable to the effects of COVID, whereas people who were less inflamed, who had less comorbidities, were much less at risk. And so, yeah, it begs to ask the question, what are we feeding our fish? And what sort of environment are we fostering to house all these beautiful organisms? Other thing that I've put on the slide is a picture of the biodiversity that happens in soil. And one of the things that I'm always moved by in medicine and in science is how there's so much mirroring. And one of the beautiful poetries of the gastrointestinal tract is that it is so deeply connected to soil, and soil biodiversity is so deeply connected to the preservation of life on Earth. And so you've got this continuum and this mirror of our microbiomes with the biomes of the Earth. And it's so apt, because what do we feed our microbiomes? We feed them food from the Earth. And so the one has a very deep direct correlation with the other. So we're talking about 100 trillion microorganisms. That's a number that I find difficult to even quantify. I think it's 10 to the 14. And the organisms that line you far outnumber your human cells. So your microbiome comprises more than 100 times more genomic content than your human cells. Historically, we used to think that all of the coding in our bodies for making proteins and breaking down fats and proteins, you could think about it as kind of software in a computer, all of the code that keeps us alive and keeps our organs functioning, we used to think only came from our human DNA. And there was a project a couple of years ago called the Microbiome Project, where they started to isolate some of the code that was used in our bodies for survival, and they realized it didn't come from human DNA, it came from microbiome DNA. And so much of what is life-sustaining and what keeps you healthy and alive is actually messaging and coding from the bugs that live in and on you, which is quite a mind-boggling idea. That second number at the top, 250 to 400 square meters, is the surface area of your gut lining cells laid out flat. And this is also something I struggle to even conceptualize, but we're talking about 2 tennis courts here. So if you unraveled your gastrointestinal tract and you split out all the gazillions of cells, it's one single layer of cells, and you laid them out flat, it would be 2 tennis courts, which is quite remarkable. And we'll talk more about how we engage, how this interface engages with what we eat and the outside world. And then another staggering number, 60 tons of food moves down this gastrointestinal tract in an average lifetime. And I think that really speaks to how impactful our diet and the use of pesticides and that extension of soil biome and human biome and the relationship between those two things is. So in 1928, Dr. Alexander Fleming, who you've probably all heard about, went on holiday, and he came home to his lab and he observed in one of his Staphylococcus aureus Petri dishes the presence of a fungi type substance called penicillium that was growing. And around the penicillium, you can see this, this halo where the staph is not growing. And so he isolated this organism and he invented antibiotics. And why this is so interesting to me is because nature is always striving for equilibrium. Every organism has a counter-organism. And when there's biodiversity, when there's community, the organisms keep each other in check. And I think that if you watch National Geographic things about rewilding the earth and the degradation of soil, you will know that in the soil, the same thing happens. When you have monocrops, when you have erosion of biodiversity in nature, you have the development of superbugs. And in what environment do superbugs exist the most in our human existence? They exist the most in hospitals. Because when you eradicate and sterilize an environment to the degree that nothing survives, then the ugliest, nastiest, most revolting creature creeping out of the corner is going to dominate and become the dictator in that arena. And I think there's so many parallels here around humans and microorganisms. But just the message here is that biodiversity is so key to balance and harmony in the microbiome of humans and in the microbiome of nature. So what have we learned from fecal transplants and rats? So a fecal transplant is when you take a person and you take another person who we call a super donor, and you use the super donor's fecal content and you insert that into the body of the recipient. And you do that via endoscopy through a tube down their throat or through a tube up their bum. And this might sound a little bit revolting, but there's a doctor in the States called Dr. Perlmutter, who some of you may have encountered. He's written a few books. And what he started doing was treating neurodegenerative disease with stool transplants and started to see amazing changes in people's bodies. And so a lot of experimentation has gone into manipulating the biomes in rats and organisms. And in fact, I read an article that was published only this month where some scientists in the States have bred sterile mice. So I'm not sure how you breed a sterile mice, but they can. And so they've got the sanitized skin surface and gastrointestinal tract. And then what they did was they cultivated 120 microorganisms from a human body. And they grew them all separately in Petri dishes. And then they threw them in one Petri dish and mixed them all up. And then they introduced them into the gastrointestinal tracts of the rats. And they waited to see what happened. And a sterile rat who has no microbes will die very soon, and its metabolic processes just don't work. They don't have an immune system. They're vulnerable to all sorts of plagues. And what they wanted to see was, did this 120 organism mixture instate itself stably in the gut of the rat? And what was the impact on the immune system? And what was the impact on its natural defenses? And remarkably, it was stable. It sort of made itself comfortable. All of the organisms survived. And when they threatened the immune systems of these rats with pathogens, they resisted them. And so what's very cool about this model is that we know we're only dealing with 120 organisms versus the 100 trillion that we're all covered with. But they're going to be able to start splicing in and splicing out different combinations of these to try and see which ones are doing what. And one of the interesting observations that has been made in other studies in rodents is that when they took stool from a fat rat and they put it in a sterile rat that was of a normal body weight, that the recipient rat, their body habitus changed dramatically, and they started to lay down fat in a very meaningful way that mimicked their donor rat stool. And in the same way, when they took fat rats and they gave them the poo of skinny rats, the fat rats got skinnier. And so the implications for this are really quite exciting and remarkable in the arena of obesity, because we're beginning to understand that so much of our energy breakdown and absorption actually happens as a byproduct of the behavior of the organisms that line our tracts. And so it's not only about what you're eating, but it's about which bacteria are breaking down which molecules and absorbing them at what rate. So on the left here, we've got your skin, and on the right, we've got your gastrointestinal lining. And your skin surface layer is made up of about 50 to 100 layers of skin cells, and your gastrointestinal layer is a single layer. And just below that single layer is your bloodstream. And so you've got your microbiome, then you've got your gastrointestinal layer, and then you've got your bloodstream. And this interface, like I mentioned and alluded before, is much bigger than your skin lining. And so we always think of our skin as the biggest interface between our bodies and our environments. Actually, it's your gastrointestinal lining. And what's exciting about this is that you have so much control of what you expose it to. And you can see, because it's only one single layer, the access that what you're putting into your system has to your bloodstream is much closer than your skin, for example. So you can imagine this layer of cells having these little Velcro junctions between each one of them. You can see here. And each of those junctions is called tight junctions. And I've put a damn wall here because that's how I like to think of it. If there's integrity between this lining and each of these cells, then the tight junctions will decide what comes in and what goes out. When this lining is compromised, like a dam wall being compromised, you get gaps between these cells, and you get microorganisms and large molecules that shouldn't be going directly into your bloodstream, entering into your bloodstream. So when the system is working and there's integrity, it's building a healthy immune system. It's selectively choosing which microorganisms to present to your bloodstream and to develop an antibody response to. And it's selectively keeping certain things out. So I like to think of it as a gatekeeper. So this gut lining is your gatekeeper, and your biome is doing all these incredible things. It's making neurotransmitters like serotonin. It's breaking down molecules for calories and energy. It's presenting organisms to your bloodstream to teach your bloodstream to resist those organisms. If this lining fails, you get, I don't want to use the word leaky gut because that's a little bit, it's a little bit controversial in certain circles, but it's becoming more and more well understood that when there's compromise in the junctions between these cells, that you get inappropriate absorption of certain things, which is going to cause a knock-on cascade of events like autoimmune disease, like other inflammatory joint problems that result in pain, like a recipe or an environment for hypertension or diabetes, and certainly things to do with weight gain or weight loss. And so your 70% of your immune system is sitting just under that layer. And I've put a human hair here because the size of those little cells is half a human hair. And so I want you to try and conceptualize these 2 tennis courts, thin as half a human hair, this intelligent membrane that's keeping things out and letting things in, almost like cellophane, and the intelligence and mastery of that. And then just in front of that is this diverse microcosm of organisms that are communicating through that cellophane interface. So I spoke a little bit earlier about mirrors in nature, the mirror of the microbiome in the body and being a reflection of the microbiome in the soil. And this is another mirror in the body that I think is really beautiful. We have tight junctions between the cells in our gut lining, and then we have tight junctions around our neurons. And we call this our blood-brain barrier. And that might be something that you've heard of before. And the reason you have a blood-brain barrier is so in the same way that your gut wants to protect certain organisms and macromolecules from being let into your bloodstream, your brain has this beautiful integral network that protects it from too much of anything crossing that barrier. And only certain drugs cross the blood-brain barrier, only certain molecules cross this barrier. And when this barrier is compromised, we have things like meningitis, which, as you all know, are very detrimental to the human brain. So there's my mirror. So you've got this mirror of these beautiful Velcro tight junctions in your gut lining, and the same in your blood-brain barrier. And it makes perfect sense then by extension that there's communicating happening between your gut and your brain. And when there's mimicry and reflection in the body, there's often a deep relationship between those 2 organ systems. And so we know now that you have half as many neurons in your gastrointestinal tract as you do in your brain, which is quite staggering and quite a new idea. And it's no accident that people feel so much emotion in the gastrointestinal tracts. And it's because they're these neurons that are communicating through your gut lining to your brain. And the way that that communication happens is via a nerve called your vagus nerve. So your vagus nerve is the longest nerve in your body, and it is the driver of your parasympathetic nervous system. So your nervous system is made up of your fight or your flight. There's a lion at my shoulder. I'm fearful. I need to survive. And your rest and digest, which is your parasympathetic nervous system. And that is for going to sleep, for feeling calm, for making a good poo. And your body is always somewhere between these 2 systems. And the agility of being able to switch from the one to the other is really important, and is a very good reflection actually of your risk for many cardiovascular diseases. And so stimulating your parasympathetic nervous system in an era where I think we're all overstimulated and too often in fight or flight is very important. And so this vagus nerve runs from your brain, down your neck, around your thorax, and spreads out into your gastrointestinal tract. And that's why when you take a slow, deep belly breath, which you might want to do right now, and you inhale and you expand your belly, you're actually stretching your vagus nerve, and you're sending rest and digest feedback to your brain to slow down, to drop your heart rate, to relax your blood pressure, to allow your gastrointestinal tract to function optimally. And so you can see in this picture, there just a little breakdown of what's happening in your body when you're in a stressed fight or flight state versus in a calm parasympathetic state. And your gut is only active in your parasympathetic calm, rest and digest state. So when there's a lion chasing you at your shoulder, or a deadline, or some domestic challenges, your gastrointestinal tract actually shuts down, and it shunts all of its energy and its focus to your survival organs. Pupils expand, your breath, your respiratory rate changes, your heart pumps harder and faster. And so it's no accident, again, that people who struggle with irritable bowel syndrome or lots of gastrointestinal ailments and discomfort, when they are more stressed and stimulating their fight or flight more than their rest and digest, their symptoms very much get worse. Run with me. We're waiting for time. Okay, so how do you wipe out your microbiome? There are a million ways to wipe out your microbiome, and I'm going to give you the silver lining a little bit later. But I think it's important to be mindful of all the things that impact the system, because you have control over so many of them. We've just spoken about stress. Cesarean section rates are higher, I think, than they have ever been in the history of man. And please don't get me wrong, cesarean sections save mothers and they save babies. But the amount of elective cesareans, especially in South Africa, far exceed the number that they should be. And you can imagine that going through your mother's birth canal is going to colonize you with all sorts of bacteria that are very different to the ones that you're going to be colonized with if you come out of a sterile slit in your mom's tummy. So that's one thing. Another thing which I actually haven't put here is that there seems to be an enormous amount of women who aren't breastfeeding anymore, and they're just using formula. And the more contact a baby has with its mother's body, with its mother's mouth, the more intimate we are with their children, with our children, we are colonizing each other all of the time. When we're intimate with our partners, when we hug one another, when we share space with people, we're actually exchanging microbiota, which is such a beautiful concept, because you can, there's all these kind of hippie concepts of being attracted to certain kinds of people or becoming more like the people that you spend the most time with. And certainly there's behavioral implications around that. But there might be, on a micro level, these micro exchanges. When you kiss or hug somebody, you swap biome. When you smooch your baby and you cuddle your baby and you breastfeed your baby, you are exchanging and colonizing their skin all the time. Pesticides have an enormous impact. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Alcohol, and I'm not just meaning disinfecting surfaces, I mean drinking alcohol. We know that alcohol kills microorganisms, so if you are pouring it down your gullet, very often you're killing off microbes. Diet is an obvious one. There are quite a lot of studies that have proven that daily meditation shifts the biome, so they can see micro changes in which colonies proliferate more or less under the influence of mindfulness. And I think that most of the studies were with only 10 to 15 minutes of mindfulness a day. So there's more science for some more mindfulness. Antibiotics, I'm going to chat more about just now. Drugs especially that change the pH of the stomach, and these are really overprescribed in my humble opinion. And I think that's there's a correlation with stress, there's a correlation with diet choices, and then geography, where you live, what your environment is inhabited with. All of these affect who is living in your gastrointestinal tract and how well. So inappropriate antibiotic use. I think that this is so important, and I think that there often isn't enough time in consultations to counsel patients enough about why inappropriate antibiotic use is harmful. And I think you can hear from the last few slides how integral not killing these organisms is to your general well-being and your mental health. And so more than 95% of upper respiratory infections are caused by viruses, not bacteria. And so using an antibiotic in that context is not killing the virus, it's just killing all of your life-affirming bacteria. Not all, but many. So there is not a single antibiotic in existence that only kills one organism. They all kill hosts of organisms. And so again, there is a very beautiful place for antibiotics, and they can be totally life-saving. But in general practice, snotty noses and little coughs, certainly antibiotics are not necessary. So just a moment here. What kind of neighborhood are you creating for your friends? And I don't mean the friends in the audience. I mean the friends that are colonizing your gastrointestinal tract. So how stressed, how mindful, what are you eating? What are you spraying your veggie garden with? These are all things that we can start to think about and be more intentional about. What does GMO really mean? So in the 1960s, in the Vietnam War, the Americans came up with a chemical called Agent Orange, which you may have heard about. And what they did with Agent Orange was they would go and spray it over jungles, and they would come back a few days later and the entire jungle would be denuded. All the foliage would be dead and on the floor. All the potentially dangerous snakes and organisms that lived in that biodiverse environment would be dead, because Agent Orange was a non-discriminate killer of basically any live creature. And one of the consequences coming out of that war was an enormous scourge of cancer, of dermatological disease, of autoimmune disease. And when they realized in a very obvious way that Agent Orange was very toxic to the human body, they decided that they were going to have to modify it for a different use and change some of the chemical composition, because they had constructed, Monsanto had constructed so much capacity to churn out this deadly chemical that they couldn't just stop production. They had to redirect or pivot production. And so in 1974, they launched this pesticide called Roundup. And what Roundup does is it inhibits a pathway that is found in small microorganisms and plants called the shikimate pathway. Now, the shikimate pathway is very important for the survival of certain plants. In fact, of all plants. And what they did, what genetically modified means, was they decided, okay, this is where we're going to grow corn. Let's take the corn molecule or genome, let's modify the genome of this corn so that it can withstand being sprayed by Roundup. And so now you've got this genetically modified corn that can sustain itself whilst being sprayed by Roundup, and everything else around it is going to die. All the biodiversity in the soil and all the biodiversity of other plants that will grow around this crop. And you can very efficiently grow a monocrop by doing this. The consequence is that many of the amino acids that should be present in that food that you are growing are no longer present because that shikimate pathway has been altered. And many of the amino acids that are produced by the shikimate pathway are integral ingredients for making neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And so this is something that people don't want to talk about. And in 2018, $289 million was paid to one claimant by Monsanto called Dwayne Johnson. And I think there are about 500,000 other people who work with Roundup every day who have all sorts of health issues because of their exposure or their direct exposure to Roundup. And so I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but most of our large crops are sprayed with Roundup. It's water soluble, so it's in our water systems. And the biggest advocate in the world for eradicating the use of Roundup is a man called Dr. Bush. And so if you're interested in reading or learning more about this, go and find Zach Bush. And he's just started an NGO called Farmer's Footprint, with a drive to popularize this information and to help people better understand the impact of using Roundup. I think that it's no accident that if you look at the maps around the world of where the most Roundup is used, they directly correlate with things like cancer, with things like autism and other neurodiverse conditions. And certainly in the same way that right in the beginning of the presentation, we showed the mirror reflection of our microbiome with the microbiome of the soil, this is speaking so much to the root cause of so much ill. So what can we do? We can get back to nature, get your hands dirty, don't be so clean. You can eat a diet that is rich in probiotics and prebiotics, and those don't have to be pills over the counter. There are a lot of foods that contain probiotics and prebiotics, fermented things like kombucha or sauerkraut. Anything with insoluble fiber is really good to help with gut health. So most of you have probably heard me use the word flaxseed powder before. That's a really beautiful source of insoluble fiber. Diversity in our diets is really important. So if you're eating the same produce every day, you're going to expose yourself to the same pesticide over and over again. And by eating a diverse diet, you're going to expose yourself to rather little bits of different poisons instead of a large dose of one, because unfortunately most of our produce is sprayed with something, if not Roundup. So appropriate use of antibiotics, I think I drove that message home. Avoiding GMO foods where possible. I think the main GMO crops in South Africa are corn and soya and wheat. Avoiding unnecessary medications, so rather changing your lifestyle or your diet if you are using something, for example, to treat heartburn. Listening to our bodies, I don't think any of us do that enough, and that's part of being in this constant fight or flight state. So the more you stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system, the more you will be able to listen to the messages that your body gives you. Eating more plants is going to have a direct impact on your fiber and on all of your micronutrients. I encourage everybody to grow some spinach or kale in your garden. It's so easy. Or even just herbs, because if you do that in your garden without spraying them, you're going to get so many of these beautiful amino acids that are integral to mental well-being. Mindfulness. Remember to slowly breathe, to stretch that vagus nerve, and to wash your hands with soap and water. Please throw away your sanitizer. I think that is my last slide. I hope you all learned something. And I hope that was valuable. What a valuable way to spend a Wednesday morning. So I'm going to stop sharing.
That was great. Thank you so much, Skye. That was really, really eye-opening. So thanks, Emil. And see you soon. I've got a dash now. Thank you. Bye.
Oops.
Thanks, Skye. That was great. Are you going to be able to share that recording somehow? I know that my mum would have loved to have been on the call, but she couldn't figure out the Google Meet.
Yes, with pleasure.